like. And you can see there a picture of the Archbishop of York, who came to one of the projects I'm going to talk about in a minute. Archdeacon in the Jails has sermons on, it has poetry on, it has publications, and it does take comments. And I didn't want to generate too much comment because I didn't have a great deal of time to moderate the blog. And that's something really important to think about, isn't it? If you're not going to have time to moderate things, then don't create them, really. Okay. Next example then of what was achieved through the use of social media, a dementia group. And how did that happen? Well, I didn't plan it at all, and that is the joy of social media. I simply reviewed a book called Still Alice. I don't know if anybody's come across it, by Lisa Genova. It's a wonderful story of a woman who is a university professor and really diagnoses herself as having Alzheimer's disease. And it is the story of her journey into Alzheimer's disease. And it's one of the most moving books I've ever read, I think. Now, I did a review of this, and suddenly I got about 20 emails, notice not actually comments on the blog, but emails from people telling me quite long stories about parents or family members who had dementia. So with their permission, I put some of them in touch with each other, and we now have a group who are meeting for support, letting each other know about dementia literature, and who have also fed into a dementia group that is run by the voluntary services in Ripon and Harrogate. I don't know why we've got a picture of a llama there, but llamas are not indigenous British animals. However, you find them all over Wensleydale now. They seem to have imported them. But I thought that was a really good example of how you can use social media almost by accident to create support groups around education and health. And really all it needs is careful moderation of the blog. The next example is something called Funky Church. Funky Church was set up in a very traditional parish in Richmond. Richmond Parish Church has a fantastic choir. They win Royal School of Church Music Awards every year, but nobody that worships there much is under about 50, or that used to be the case. And they desperately wanted to start a service that would be more for younger families and children and teenagers. And we had one individual, a lady called Gillian, who is inspirational, a young mother, and I think she almost single-handedly created a new worshipping community through her contacts with other parents, through the use of a blog, and through the use of WordPress and Facebook. And what Gillian does really is to describe in advance the worship that is going to happen. A lot of people in Britain have almost got to the point where they have so rarely been inside a church that it is threatening for them to go through the church door. So what Gillian does says, if you come to our service on Sunday or Tuesday or whenever it is, what will happen is you will be met at the door, there will be activities for you to do. At some point we will have a cup of coffee, we will have a Bible reading. It might sound obvious to us, but it's the sort of thing that relaxes people if they know that that is going to happen. She also creates anticipation. You'll see the number 6 there. If they have an event coming up, they've done baptisms in the River Swale, they've had pet services, they've had the Archbishop of York to visit. She will blog, in 3 weeks' time, you can come and attend the baptisms. And then she'll say, in 2 days' time, the baptisms will be happening. And then she gets down to sort of 6 hours' time. And it just generates anticipation. And if you look at the Twitter that's going on around Richmond, people are sort of retweeting all these things. So she used Twitter, Facebook, WordPress and a blog, and we went from 0, because there was nothing there, we went from 0 to 90 attendees in 4 months, and it's now run for over 2 years, and Gillian is now training as a reader, and the project is sort of nationally known. I wouldn't overblow it, but it is talked about around the whole country. It's activity-based worship for all the family. It started in the market town of Richmond, but then it's spread into the village churches. So we've now got sort of little funkies in some of the village churches around. And I thought that that was really an inspirational project. The only connection with my blog was that I took it up at a very early stage, promoted it a lot, got the Archbishop of York to come and made sure that we had pictures all over everything of him participating. Next example, the project called Saxon Roots. Again, this was something that wasn't planned. Most of what I'm talking about wasn't planned. I had a personal interest in Saxon history and got one of the professors from Leeds University involved in helping us to visit all the Saxon sites. And my plan was to create a trail that people could cycle round. What actually happened was somebody else who blogs got interested, but his interest is in worship. So he scratched his head a bit and thought, gosh, all these wonderful Saxon sites, we could use that as an inspiration for contemporary worship. And so he's put together his own blog and Facebook page, and he started a service. I think the first one was in Ripon Cathedral, but the idea is of the Saxon preaching cross. In Saxon times, the churches were wooden and very small, most of them, some of them were stone. You couldn't get a lot of people in, and most villages didn't actually have a church. So where people really worshipped was in front of the preaching cross, where they had the baptisms, they had the sacraments, they had the preaching, they had discussions, they had sort of village announcements, you know, or town crier type of scenario. And so Nick took that image and created worship out of it. And I just want to read you this. The first service was in Ripon Cathedral, and then he's branched out into the villages, and this is what he says. It's always been part of our vision to develop Saxon root services outside as well as inside churches. One idea we would like to experiment with is taking Saxon roots to the villages. For this to work, there needs to be a church community within easy reach of our base in Ripon, willing to work in partnership with us to make it come alive. The format of a Saxon Roots service lends itself to physically exploring a village as part of the service. Ideally, we need villages where there's an outdoor focal point everyone can gather around to act as our preaching cross. So this may be a historic cross, it may be a war memorial, a horse trough, a pub, car park, or even a phone box. We had one in a phone box. There was a little, somebody put a nice bunch of flowers, you know, and a carpet in the phone box. During parts of the service, during which we explore different prayer stations, because part of the worship is about walking around, we would ask people nearby to host these prayer stations in their gardens or a shed or a greenhouse. And you can see how he's drawing the whole village into participating in this act of worship. And use the building blocks of the Holy Communion service. So we have a collect, we have a reading, we have a Eucharistic prayer, but they're expressed very differently from how they would be in a church building. And that's Nick's blog. And again, he uses the technique that Gillian used. He always describes in advance what's going to happen, even down to whether you get burgers or bacon sandwiches this week. That's important. Next example, my Social Horizons blog. This is a blog that I've started because I wanted a conversation in social justice, community development and theology. Now, my husband works for IBM, and he always says to me, Janet, why does the church spend so much time talking about the past? He spends his entire day thinking about what the future might be and imagining the future. And so the idea of this particular blog is that we try as much as possible to explore what might be in the future. And so the themes that I'm developing at the moment, it's very new, are end-of-life care and dementia provision. And that's because in North Yorkshire we have a very high incidence of dementia in the population and an ageing population, and I'm particularly interested in that. So that's a personal thing. I'm very interested in how communities support old age and also in the use of social media to do that. I won't talk about that today, but that's another whole area to think about. I'm also interested in politics and the church. Okay, so those were the 6 projects. And I just wanted maybe to take a moment now to ask, what does social media leave out? Okay, so I hope I've persuaded you that you can achieve a lot through social media, and that social media is not some kind of compartment of life that's separated from real life, you know. But there are certain things you can't do with social media. It does presence differently, doesn't it, really? I would argue that you can provide pastoral, moral and prayer support through social media. And we've got examples in Britain of e-churches and I-churches where people are being pastored through social media. But I think it's a bit more difficult for blogs and social media to provide practical support, things that require touch, things that require me sitting down and having eye contact with you. It does to some extent perhaps devalue the sense that we've all had the same shared experience. We haven't all been present at the same time in the same moment. So you need to think very carefully about how you promote all of those things and where they are absent. In particular, touch and smell are obviously omitted. And there is now a new branch of theology called haptic theology, which is researching what it means to do theology without touch. Okay, and actually asking questions like, you know, what does it mean to have a church where you do everything? You have fellowship, you have prayer, you have study, but you don't ever come together and break bread and touch the bread and the wine and touch each other. Okay, what does it mean for the sacramental life of the church? Can you have a church that is entirely digital? Those sorts of questions. And I think you have to think very carefully about what community is. Community exists differently. I get very cross when people say, oh, there's no sense of community in the digital world. My husband, working for IBM, has a little purple coffee cup that he can flash up on his screen. So if he wants a coffee break, he can have coffee with people in Japan and South Africa. And they know each other very well. And sometimes they will have met because they will have trained each other, and sometimes they won't have met. And it's a wonderful global community. And when difficult things happen in your life, it can be extremely supportive. So there is digital community. However, it doesn't feel like the community I have at home in North Yorkshire, where I can pop across the road to the neighbours and share their cake. You know, it's different, isn't it? It may be more global, less local, it may be less immediate. I think in some ways it may be less rooted. But I think you need to explore very carefully, what does it mean to have community or not have community. And finally, Durham University is running a project called Codec, and I'm on the steering group for that. And it's a project which is aiming to research what is happening in digital space from a faith, and particularly from a biblical literacy perspective. So they are exploring the interrelationship between Christianity and the media, spirituality and the internet, understanding the development in human relationships and self-perception within a media world. They are researching and developing teaching tools appropriate for the digital media world. So they're running all sorts of distance learning courses and modules and that kind of thing. They're assessing and resourcing the Christian community's appreciation of the digital environment. So they're doing research to assess what is going on, but they are also providing quite a lot of tools which are now increasingly being taken up in the Dales. We've got 1 or 2 projects, quite small projects, running in the Dales. They're increasing the church's ability to communicate effectively in the digital environment. And they're also sponsoring a project called the Big Bible Project, which is promoting conversations about biblical literacy in the digital world. And you might like to perhaps have a look at that, because it's quite a big project, much too complicated for me to go into in great detail. But it is becoming now, I think, internationally known. They've got money from America as well as from the UK going into it, and they're increasing their staffing. So I just wanted to say to you that social media is fantastic fun. I am not an expert. I knew nothing about it in 2010, and I've simply taught myself as I've gone along. And I think I was saying to somebody over lunch, it's really important to have a go. If you make a mistake or what you planned doesn't happen, that really doesn't matter, because something else will happen and it will promote life, I hope, in the service of God's kingdom. So encourage you all to have a go at whatever stage you're at, really. And thank you very much for listening this afternoon.